Chapter 13, Kingdom Plantae. We've covered a number of different kingdoms. We had several kingdoms that had to do with the bacteria. Then we had the ones that had to do with the fungi. Now we're with the plant kingdom. And we're chapter 13 and chapter 14 are the two chapters that deal with this kingdom. Then we go on to another kingdom right after that. So the study of plants is called botany. Okay? So if you've ever, somebody who's a botanist is somebody who studies plants. There are many different kinds of plants in the world. So there's a lot to study. Quite often, students your age probably aren't all that interested in plants. It's more of an adult thing, it seems like. Even though I do run into some students who love to work in the garden and stuff like that. I can't say I got a good experience at that, because when I was growing up, my parents had a garden at first when I was up through, I think, middle school, 9th grade maybe, and did a lot of, my mom liked to can her own food and process her own food, so there was a lot of that. So consequently, my wife and I don't have gardens, but we love plants. You know, we have a lot of landscaping that we like to have. Okay, so let's look at the characteristics of the species within the plant kingdom. The first thing it says, they all are eukaryotic. Does anybody remember what it meant to be eukaryotic? We have it like in almost every chapter. So what does it mean to be eukaryotic? I didn't know that, I think, for our final, so yes. Membrane-bound nucleus. And? Yeah, okay. And the organelle, you can see both kinds, membrane-bound organelle and non-membrane-bound organelle. Okay? So that's what it means to be eukaryotic. So we're making a statement about the cells. Okay? Now, they all are multicellular. In other words, they're not colonies of cells. They're multicellular. That means they have to have more than one kind of cell for their survival. And these cells are organized into tissues. So for it to be a tissue, what was that? What was our definition of a tissue? We haven't had it lately because nothing was a tissue. But what is the definition of a tissue? Okay, a group of cells that are performing a common function. A group of cells that are carrying a common function. So like, for instance, like red blood cells would be a tissue because they perform a common function, and that is to carry oxygen and a bit of carbon dioxide, mainly oxygen. Did I put you guys in the wrong spot, Jake? Or do I need to have you two switch? Now, some of these actually have organs, where they're a group of tissues that each are performing their own unique function, but they need several kinds of tissues to pull off the big process. Okay? So they have more than one kind of tissue. So there's some of them that have organs. Most have chlorophyll. What do you suppose that's for? What do plants use chlorophyll for? For photosynthesis, to make their own food. Now, they will have other pigments, and you've probably seen plants, they don't all have the same color. In fact, there's some plants that are not green. They're still carrying on photosynthesis. There still is chlorophyll, but the other pigments are kind of masking that color. And sometimes you see these, particularly when fall comes, they stop producing chlorophyll, and you start seeing these other colors. Like some of you may have some maples. We have one growing in our backyard that's an autumn blaze maple. Turns really brilliant orangey red. Or some of you maybe have burning bushes, Burning bushes, you know, in fall they turn this really bright red. That red's been there all along. It's just been covered up by the green. They all have cell walls made out of cellulose. Okay? They all have cell walls made out of cellulose. It's not like we talked about some before where some of them had cell walls of cellulose and some had peptidoglycan, and that long word. Most of them are autotrophic. What does that mean? What does it mean to be autotrophic?
Self-feeding.
Self-feeding. Auto means self, troph means feeding. They feed themselves. How do they do that? By carrying on photosynthesis. Okay? That's how they make their own food. Now, some are heterotrophic. What does that mean? They feed on other living things. Can you think of a plant that does that? Yeah, the Venus flytrap will trap flies and derive some of it nutrients from the digested fly. Okay? So you get some of the nutrients that might not be in the soil. Quite often they grow where the soils aren't all that great, and sometimes they need some nutrients they can't get from the soil by digesting the flies. There are some that are parasitic. In other words, they don't grow directly in the ground. They grow on another plant. I think it's like mistletoe is an example of one of those. I don't know if orchids are or not. I can't remember where orchids fit. Orchids often grow in other plants, but they may not necessarily be a parasite. But parasite means they derive all their nutrients from the other plant they're growing on. I remember when we were driving, I think it was down through Kansas into Oklahoma, especially in fall, you can see them. The trees have lost all the leaves, but there's still these green bunches of looks like twigs and stuff up in the tree, and those are actually, it's mistletoe growing up in the tree. Okay? All reproduce sexually. So in other words, there will be a sperm and an egg somehow in their reproductive process for it to be sexually. Many have the ability to asexually reproduce themselves, you know, by producing a structure that might fall off and sprout on the ground or something like that. Most are sessile. Does anybody know what that word means? What does it mean to be sessile? I'll give you a hint. It's the opposite of motile or motile. What does that mean? What? Still, is that what you're saying? Or, yeah, to stay still. Do plants roam around? It'd be kind of weird to think of that possibly. I know that sometimes in cartoons they have trees that will, you know, kind of like spooky cartoons, and where they'll have trees, you know, trying to scare people because they can move around. But trees don't move around. You know, where they sprout is kind of where they're stuck for the rest of their life, whether it's a good spot or not. Some, they say, float. Give me an example of a plant that floats. You know, like lily pads. Okay? Lots of places in the world they have lily pads. There's big leaves that just float on top of the water. A lot of animals like to stand on top of it and sometimes feed from that perch that they have right there. Now, some produce motile gametes. Now, usually egg and sperm are kind of stuck in spot, but they have to get to each other, and quite often it's the male, the sperm part, that moves around, and they typically like to have a watery environment for them to move around. So, in other words, this plant's probably going to need to be around or near water. So we said they had vascular tissue. When you, if you were to bite or look at a stalk of celery, you see those little stringy things that are inside of celery when you bite it off. Those strands inside there is actually the vascular tissue. These are the tissues that carry like it says, water and materials, nutrients that the plant's going to need. It'll carry it like from the roots up to the leaves. Usually when you eat celery, you don't eat the leaves, you don't eat the roots. They usually cut off the root, you usually cut off the leaves, and you eat the stalk, the stem part of the plant. Okay, here is, in this particular plant here, which I don't think would be all that different than maybe like celery. It actually has two kinds of tissues. One that carries water and nutrients, and one that carries food. Back, the leaves make the food, and so they need to spread it out to the rest of the plant to, grow their own cells and nourish those cells. But those are two kinds. Now, there are other tissues in there. There's part of the celery that's easy to chew, and part of it that you have to chew a lot more on. The rest of it is more of a storage kind. This parenchyma is the kind of cell that is like storing food that's been made by the leaves. Okay, now, quite often plants have seeds. All plants don't have seeds, but many of them do. The seed has food stored inside of it, but it also includes a little tiny embryonic plant inside of it, which quite often you don't see, because you just eat the seed. But I don't know if you've ever seen like bean seeds. When they break apart, you'll see this white little pointy thing up in one corner of the bean seed. And that's actually the embryonic plant. It's a little tiny plant inside of it. Part of it will grow into the roots, part of it will grow and become the leaves and the stem. Here it would be not all that different than a bean. I don't know what this plant is, but it looks a lot like what maybe if you were planting beans in your garden. Out of the seed, when it sprouts, you'll have roots that go down to derive nourishment, nutrients out of the soil, and then you'll have the stem and the leaves come out the other side. And they will stick up above the ground, but quite often in beans, the whole seed comes up with the stalk, the stem. And this is actually the halves of the bean. The bean actually has two halves. Each half has food stored inside of it, and as to nourish the plant while it is early in its growth until it is mature enough to be able to manufacture its own food with photosynthesis. So as it's going, it's deriving nourishment out of here, and eventually these will kind of shrivel up and then fall off. They're no longer needed because the plant can make all its own food now. But this seed, contains everything in there to make it last a long time, until it has a chance to sprout. Some seeds have the remarkable ability to stay in the soil for long periods of time before they sprout. I know that farmers know this quite well. These farmers out here, they plant their crops, and then after they're a certain height, they will spray them with herbicides to kill the weeds. So they're constantly killing off the weeds. So those fields are not getting new weed seeds there, but they have to do it every year because there's still seeds in the ground from weeds that have been there 20, 30, 40 years before they'll sprout. So it's like you can never get rid of them. You have to do something to the soil to sterilize it. Now, sometimes what people will do is they'll put black plastic on top of the soil and let the sun heat up the plastic and the dirt underneath it, and it'll kill these seeds. And that's one way of doing it. But while that's happening, you can't grow anything, because it's getting stifling hot underneath it. But I don't know what the different kind of seeds there. One of those I know is pumpkin seeds. I don't know, anybody eat pumpkin seeds? You like pumpkin seeds? I definitely like sunflower seeds, but pumpkin seeds, pitas, is that what they're also called? Another name for pumpkin seeds, I think they're called pita, P-I-T-A, I think. It's also, there's a Hispanic food thing called pitas as well, but they're not the same thing. Now, let's talk about some plants that they're very tiny. They don't have any vascular tissue, so they have no means of bringing water and nutrients great distances. The water and the nutrients kind of seep between cells, sort of like if you would stick a paper towel into water, and you know how the water kind of soaks up, wicks up in the, that's how these little tiny plants, they don't grow very tall. The example of that is like moss. You ever seen moss very tall? No, it's usually really short and tiny, isn't it? Well, they don't have vascular tissues. They can never grow very tall because of that. So moss is going to be our example of that. Then we have some plants that have vascular tissue. Okay, so these have vascular tissue, so in other words, they can grow taller, but they don't make seeds like you and I would think of. They have to reproduce themselves in a different way than with seeds. And into that we have the ferns, not the ones sitting in the back. So we'll talk about ferns here, but we're not talking about her or her brothers. Then we have some plants that are vascular plants and they produce seeds. And that's going to be what most of the ones that you and I are familiar with. You know, that when somebody thinks of a plant, they're going to be in this category right here. They have vascular tissues. They can carry water and nutrients and food great distances. Think about the redwood forests, sequoias, and like that can be hundreds of feet tall. They can move their water and nutrients huge distances, and they produce seeds. So into that, we have some that don't produce flowers. That would be like pine trees and evergreens. No, you don't see flowers on those. But they still have a reproductive cycle that's a sexual reproductive cycle. Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Then we have those that do produce flowers. So any plant that you can think of that produces flowers would fall into that category. Obviously, sunflowers, like we have a picture of right here. Let's go back now to the plants that are non-vascular, so they are very short, and this would be like moss. Now, most of us never get that close to moss that we can actually see this, what's going on there. But there is actually a tiny little shoot like this with little tiny leaves on it, and they're growing very close together. The benefit of growing very close together, they can hold a lot of water in that. So moss, if you've ever picked up moss, you know it always feels damp because they can hold a lot of water. They have sort of root-like structures. It's not the classic root. It doesn't have all the same parts that a root have, but it functions, and we call them rhizoids. Have we had that name before? And what had rhizoids? A mushroom had rhizoids, right? So it functions like a root, but they're really tiny. They don't go through the normal growth cycle that you normally would find with a regular plant. But it serves the same purpose for attachment and for absorbing water and nutrients. So let's look at the life cycle of a moss. Okay? So through its whole life cycle, we have the one stage, it actually has two stages, which we will call alternation of generation. And we'll also learn later on that sometimes we only think of this one stage, but it actually has another stage quite often that goes unnoticed. Maybe because it's underground, or maybe it's so tiny you can't see it, but it does have. So we have what's called the gametophyte stage. The first part gives us kind of a clue. It has gametes. Okay? This leafy shoot produces both male and female gametes, an egg and a sperm. Then there's the other part that we may or may not see called the sporophyte stage. This one produces spores. So in other words, more like the asexual means of reproducing itself. And these are really tiny. They have little tiny stalks that are probably no bigger around than maybe like a thread. And they have a little, like it says, a capsule on the top in which the spores are produced. And so unless you are looking at the right time and at the right place, you'd probably just go totally unnoticed. But if you look at moss a lot, you know, if you had places where moss would grow, you would eventually see this phase. It looks like it suddenly grown a few sparse hairs on the top of it. When we went on a missions trip to Camp Calvin Crest, I think it was our first year there, the students that were in biology back then, and I don't think I think I was teaching biology back then. We had covered this, you know, in the first part of January, and then we went up to the missions trip at the end of February, and the moss was in this stage right here. You could actually see, and one of the students just happened to be looking at the moss and going, "Hey, Mr. Hubert, isn't this what we were talking about?" And sure enough, it had the little tiny black things sticking up from the green. So you could, but you had to be close to be able to notice it. Now the male part in the gametophyte is produced in a word that we're using the same word we've had before. Remember we had antheridia? Well, this is same name because it produces the same kind of thing. It produces the male gamete, which we call the sperm. Okay? Then we have the place where the female gamete is produced, which is the egg or ovum, is produced in a structure that's called the archegonia. Okay? So it's the female gametophyte part, and it produces an egg. In almost every example of living thing, the egg never moves around. It's the sperm has to somehow get there. Sometimes it has to swim to this spot. Sometimes the organism will actually deposit its sperm near the egg to fertilize it, but somehow the sperm has to get to the egg, but the egg doesn't move. And so here would be kind of like to picture the whole life cycle. This would be the gametophyte right here. Here's the archegonia producing the egg. Here is the antheridia producing the sperm. And here's those structures particularly that are producing the sperm. The sperm have flagella, so they have a way of swimming. So obviously they have to have, what are they going to swim through? Typically swim in what? Water. So that's the reason why moss usually grows around places where there's lots of water, so that they can fertilize themselves. So this is going to produce a young sporophyte that will grow into another leafy stalk, and on this stalk will grow out these little capsules that produce the spores, and these spores will then fall on the ground or wherever they are either washed to or blown to, and it will germinate. That spore will germinate, and usually it'll germinate in the ground. You can't even see this. It's not like when you plant a seed and you can see the things sprout up above the ground. You don't see this going on. This is all happening underground. So the part where it's producing the spores is pretty tiny. Is almost invisible, and it starts out growing underground. And only when it shoots up above the ground do you actually start to see the new moss, and that's actually already in the gametophyte stage. Okay. Now, another kind of plant that has vascular tissue, remember the moss didn't. This has vascular tissue, but it doesn't produce seeds either. Okay? And that's like the fern. Okay? They have vascular tissue. They produce with spores. Now, most people haven't ever noticed it, but how many of you have had fern plants growing in your yard or in your house? Any of you have ferns? Ferns would have ferns. Let's be logical, right? But if you've ever looked on the backside of a fern leaf, or frond is the right name for it, the leaflets have little brown spots on them. That's where the spores are produced. Okay? So phylum. Now, has this first part looked familiar? Maybe a kind of dinosaur? Pterodactyl? That sound familiar? Okay, that's where, this is Pteridophyta, is the name of the phylum to which the ferns belong. Now, the leaf of a fern has a little stalk or petiole. The little stalk that a leaf is on is called petiole. Even no matter what leaf it is, it's called the same thing. And then it has this part right here, the blade. And all that together is called the frond. So we talk about fern fronds. They kind of grow out of a mass of tissue that is typically underground, the part you don't see, and out of that grow actual roots that absorb water and nutrients, and then out of this, these fern fronds will grow out of that. Now, if you've ever looked at a fern frond when it's just sprouting, let's say, what does it look like? It looks like a little, they call them fiddlebacks. And actually some people eat the fiddlebacks. I'm not sure in what context, but I know I've seen some dishes on some menus that had fiddlebacks as part of it. I don't know, can't remember if it was in a salad or something like that, or what it was, but they're wound up. Now, if you ever look at a fiddle or a violin, what does the end of the violin look like? Doesn't it kind of go like this and kind of spirals around? That's what these fronds look like when they're just newly formed. They look like they're all wound up, all coiled up, and then they slowly unwind, and the leaflets get bigger, and then you see the regular fern frond. So those little brown dots that I said were on the backside of the leaf, each dot is called a sorus, or since each little leaflet has one of those on it, we talk about all of them would be the sori, and they are the structures that actually produce the spores. Remember we said ferns reproduce with spores? So the spores will come out the back when they're dried. That's kind of one of the reasons why they're brown. When we see them is they've already produced the spores, they're mature, they're breaking open, and the spores are being released to make more ferns. Okay? So that is the sporophyte stage, and we see that one. Notice on the moss we saw the gametophyte stage. The sporophyte was really hard to see. The gametophyte stage here is very tiny. It's kind of a heart-shaped structure. It's actually produced when the gametes that came from the Antheridia and Archegonia join. It forms a prothallus. We've had thallus before, but this is called a prothallus. And out of that will grow ultimately the part that we will see, the fronds, which are so in this stage over here is where we see those spores. These on the backside, these little brown dots where the spores are being produced. That's the sporophyte generation. So we get to see that one. Moss, we couldn't see that one. It's hard to see. And gametophyte, we could see it. This one, the spores land on the ground, kind of like sprout in the ground and grow in the dirt, and you can't see it. So, not every organism that alternates its generation between sporophyte and gametophyte can you always see the same stage? Just depends on how God created that plant. Okay, so there is the sorus. That's where the spores are produced. Okay, the prothallus is what forms from a germinating spore, and on the prothallus is where the antheridia and the archegonia are formed, are found, that produce the egg and the sperm. And since this is underground and ferns like to grow where it's wet, so the sperm can move through the moisture that's in the soil. So yeah, the little coil, so they look coiled up like this at first. They look kind of brownish looking, they're not even green. And they uncoil and then kind of grow in size until it looks like a typical fern frond. Okay?